everyone, and welcome back. I'm sorry that tea break made it absolutely impossible to get back by 20 past. That was not your fault, but we will try and make sure we get everything in before those of you who are going off for a tour of the Muller have to leave. So we've had an excellent start to the afternoon with the sort of more technical aspects, and we've now got three speakers who will talk at the more personal level, as it were. We'll start off with Graham Farmelo, who's here on the platform, who will talk about John Cockcroft, the quiet visionary. Then Michael Smyth, who's writing the biography, will give some personal views and in the context of the college. And finally, we have Chris Cockroft, who will talk about memories of my father. And then again, I hope we'll have time for some questions at the end. So over to Graham.
Thank you very much, Athene. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you for that, those words of introduction. John Cockcroft. He has many faults. For example, his knowledge is quite wide, but not at all profound. His views are of a rather everyday hue. Those were the words written by James Chadwick, the great physicist who oversaw the work of Cockcroft and Walton and many others in the Cavendish, and exhausted James Chadwick in Washington, D.C. on the 2nd of June, 1945. And he was writing in support for Cockcroft taking on the job of leading the British nuclear establishment. You wonder what he would have thought if he didn't want him to get the job. He did say, Chadwick actually, if you look at the message as a whole, and he makes the points that all of us here would know about John Cockcroft, what Chadwick called his many virtues, attention to detail, his equable temperament, his inexhaustible patience and persistence. The one thing that doesn't come across in his assessment of John Cockcroft was something that, in my view, became plain only in the 2 decades that followed the end of the Second World War. And that is, as I would like to argue this afternoon, that John Cockcroft, for all his quietness and his unassuming nature, was a visionary. In other words, somebody who has original, imaginative ideas about what the future can or might be. There is Chadwick, and at the end of the war, this man, absolutely nonpareil experimenter, was pretty much exhausted, wanted nothing really to do with taking ahead the British nuclear program. Like many other people who worked on that program as part of the Manhattan Project, moved off to other things, but not John Cockcroft. He was he was the top-flight nuclear physicist who stayed in the game and worked on what I believe is one of the very greatest technological achievements of this country in the 20th century, which was setting up what you might call the British nuclear project after the war. The three people who were most responsible for this, and it was a big, big project, were what they called in Whitehall the 3 atomic knights. Christopher Hinton, on your left, Bill Penny on the right, very keen golfer and footballer, sometimes reasonably accurately known as the British Oppenheimer, and our John Cockcroft, here having a mid-afternoon cup of tea. This was a remarkable achievement because after the Second World War, it needs to be stated plainly in a talk like this, after the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Los Alamos laboratory had done its work. The British contingent, roughly 24 people, were effectively bundled out of that establishment without their notebooks and with just their memories intact. It was then the Attlee government, responding to what you might call isolationism after the war, manifest in particular in the McMahon Act, that stopped the United States collaborating with Britain and other countries. It was the Attlee government that decided that Britain needed its own nuclear industry to build a nuclear deterrent independent of the United States and to start a civil nuclear power industry. And together those things would be served by its own nuclear research establishment. Now, this became an establishment that ran for tens of thousands of people, with the research establishment run, overseen by John Cockcroft, about 5,000 people. This was, I would argue, and I'm not just trying to give all the credit to John Cockcroft here, this was a visionary achievement. Make no mistake, to go from nowhere. In the early documents, if you look at it, it says that this was dismissed as, or what the worry was, that it was going to be seen as a house of pleasure for visiting nuclear scientists. That's how the Harwell that's what the worry was. And what John Cockcroft did was turn it into a world-class centre of nuclear research, serving the weaponry research and civil nuclear power. And one needs to stress it was always a nuclear power that had the most interest to him, although he recognised they were all connected. He was very quiet. He was not the most talkative or charismatic of leaders, but my goodness, he brought some of the élan, the joie de vivre of the Cavendish of the 1930s that we've been hearing about to the intellectual atmosphere of Harwell, setting up in particular a magnificent crazy committee where no idea was too crazy to discuss. I'd love to get my hands on the proceedings of that crazy committee, which existed and came up with wild ideas. That is not the work of somebody who was a very, very conservative, with a small c, operator. People knew that all three of those people and the people around them were thinking big. They were thinking nationally, and they were thinking for the good of the country's science and technology. And no one was more effective at dealing with the different political hues at the top of government than John Cockcroft. Here he is on the 30th of December 1954 with Winston Churchill, shortly to end his second premiership. The three atomic knights had to serve Attlee, then they had to serve the Churchill government, and there really was barely a heartbeat between those administrations. But Cockcroft knew better, I would argue, than anybody else at the top of that organisation, that it's one thing to look at the practicalities of using nuclear energy. It's another to understand it deeply at a deep scientific level in the way that his mentor, Lord Rutherford, whom he regarded as the greatest scientist of the 20th century. From a Rutherfordian perspective, you have to go ever deeper into the heart of matter. And it was with the support of the younger people at Harwell that he was a prime mover, as Rolf told us, in the setting up of CERN. It certainly wasn't his idea, it was the idea of several people. Niels Bohr is somebody that spring to mind, somebody who really did see that the idea of probing matter at a finer and finer level, at higher and higher energies, was more than any one country could bear. And out of that grew the wonderful vision that we heard about of CERN. Initially, with Bohr, his hands all over it, it was going to be in Copenhagen, but Churchill's scientific grand vizier Lindemann said that was too vulnerable to Russia. So that was one of the reasons why they moved it to Geneva, which is where, of course, it now flourishes, as we've heard. It needs to be said here that not everyone was happy about putting all of, or so high a proportion of British particle physics research funds into an international project. And that was one of the things, if you look back at those early CERN papers, that you see, in my judgment anyway, that Cockcroft was somebody, with Rudy Piles and others, they saw that this was the future. My goodness, in my opinion, they were proved absolutely right about that. I might say Chadwick was a superb experimenter. Cockcroft regarded him and Blackett as the two greatest scientists he knew who worked under Rutherford. but certainly Chadwick did not move easily into the new generation of big teams and big budgets and what have you. That wasn't his forte. His forte was the benchtop experiment, of which he was a complete and utter master. Cockcroft was not somebody who just wanted to talk to other scientists. In today's language, Cockcroft knew the value of what we now call public engagement. In the Atomic Scientists Association, set up in this country soon after the war, particularly by Joseph Rotblat, but by others as well, there was a group of scientists very concerned to have what we now call a kind of dialogue with each other and with the public. Now, this nuclear science wanted to be open, like in some sense, like all science. It wants to be out there and shared. But in sensitive areas like this, particularly in the weaponry domain, governments wanted it to be secret. So there was always going to be tensions here. So if you go over to the National Archives near where I live, you see that MI5 and MI6 are all over the Atomic Scientists Association, with all these prime movers mail being intercepted. John Cockcroft was the only one of the Atomic Knights who took a really leading role in that association. And you can see here in this college, in Trinity and elsewhere, evidence of that in his radio talks on, I think it's on what we would now call Radio 3, and talks that he gave around the country. He gave a very illuminating talk at the Harrogate Film Festival in 1959, when he spoke rather almost glumly about scientists feeling uncomfortable about being perceived, as he put it, as a race apart, monastic people living what he called a cloistered existence. And he reflected on what he called the painful experience of having to learn how to explain yourself to people who really know next to nothing about what you're doing. But he was determined to do it, and he saw the value of the intrinsic importance of communicating with the people who were funding what he was doing. And he brought that generosity of spirit to the spirit of higher education too. In the the mid-1950s, Cockcroft knew of the initiative that was being set up. Largely, I would give Frederick Lindemann the most credit for this. He was the one who drafted Churchill's famous speech to MIT in 1949 for the need for a better scientific and technological training within Great Britain. And this had several different visions for it, but it eventually became Churchill College. The college in which we're now sitting became what Lindemann and later Churchill wanted to be his contribution to that debate and to that action. Churchill chaired the fundraising and organised the high-quality alcoholic beverages that were served at the meetings, I gather. And John Cockcroft was offered the job of master of that college in the entrance hall of the Athenaeum in November 1958, before zipping off to Heathrow. He never forgot it. And he then, as many people here know better than I do, took on that mantle with considerable imagination. He called Churchill College, in a lecture given in Toronto in 1969, a college for the modern world. Notice it's forward-looking. He wasn't talking necessarily about being the greatest or the most distinguished scientist. He was talking about a modern conception of a college. And it's very important to recognise that everyone that I've spoken to who knew of him and knew of his work, no one would have called him a fuddy-duddy. He had tremendous attention. His passion was building. He sometimes said that in letters to his wife, I noted, how he loved to build things. And here he could get right down and dirty with the architects here. and work out how he could arrange the social life, so to speak, of the college, such that these academic conversations that he believed were so dear, how they could be encouraged. In his presentations on the college, I've also noticed how he wanted to strengthen links with industry. That would have been completely passé in Cambridge a few decades before. But he wanted to actually increase them. And I'm biased, I know, but he very strongly encouraged the, in my opinion, quite brilliant idea of having a really good archive at the centre of the college. What in modern language we call the unique selling point. The idea of a brand new college having an archive rooting the college in history. First of all through the great Churchill archive and later through other prime ministers, other distinguished figures and diplomats, and also nuclear scientists, including Cockcroft himself. And I just wanted to add note my delight that the Cockcroft family have given his personal papers to that archive, and I think that's going to be a wonderful thing. I would only hope that we could preserve the Cockcroft children cryogenically for another 5 decades, so that we can interpret his handwriting. So, Chadwick, in 1960, he was writing to John Cockcroft. Chadwick's time after leaving the Manhattan Project to the British Project do not make happy reading. His archive is here in our archive centre, and you see an undoubtedly great scientist. Very dispirited, constantly ill. He was absolutely worn out by the tremendous service he did our country in the Second World War. And he had, unfortunately, the unpleasant experience of being a master of a college that didn't really take him to its heart. It was at Gonville and Keys. But he did write to keep in touch with old friends, and the last letter he wrote John Cockcroft was here, this one here, in July 1967. I remember this myself because this was the early stages of the Sergeant Pepper summer, as we called it. It's a charming letter. It's the last of several letters that he wrote. And you can see here in those letters the almost amazement of the distinguished supervisor seeing somebody, a student whom he'd underestimated, go on to do really, really great things. If you look at what Cockcroft had done, and Chadwick had seen this from his house in North Wales and latterly in Cambridge, he'd seen that very young and unassuming young man, one of the quietest people in that Cockcroft group. He'd seen him be one of the co-builders of the British nuclear industry, sponsoring an organisation, CERN, that was really taking off, well on the way to what it is now, a wonderful global leader. A distinguished advocate and practitioner of public engagement, and here the master of the monument to the international monument to Winston Churchill himself. And what I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is not just a monument to Churchill, but to our first master here, John Cockcroft, who I would say was not just a visionary, but a visionary who could really get things done. Thank you very much.
(1924). John Cockcroft, aged 27, stands outside the Senate House in Cambridge after receiving his degree in mathematics as a B-star wrangler in Part 2. Many of you will remember your own graduation day, and looking back, may now regard it as one of your life's turning points. For John, it was much more. In a 1951 interview, he said, "It was the greatest of the great days of my scientific career." That's the benefit of hindsight. Yet he only stood there in 1924 through a combination of good fortune, the encouragement of others, and of course his own efforts. His scientific future, although perhaps sensed, was far from assured. In the next few minutes, I'm going to elaborate on these transformative early years. John was born in 1897 in Todmorden, the eldest son of John A. Cockcroft. You can see him here, standing on the right, aged about 13 or 14, along with his 4 younger brothers. His father owned a medium-sized textile weaving business. So compared to many, the family was comfortably off, but certainly not wealthy. His early education and that of his brothers was very much a local affair. It began with the town's elementary school and then progressed in 1909 to Todmorden Secondary School. School magazines after this date give their first clues to his academic abilities. He won form prizes year after year, not just in maths and science, but in many other subjects. Yet it wasn't all schoolwork. He became an important player in the school's football and cricket teams. In those days, it was usual for the eldest son to join the family business upon leaving school. He would then spend years learning its technology and practices in readiness to succeed his father. John's parents chose a different path for their eldest son. They let him apply to Manchester University to study mathematics. He duly gained a place and won a West Riding County Scholarship to cover his fees and costs. Yet even before he arrived there in the autumn of 1914, World War I had broken out. It'll be over by Christmas, was everyone's early hope. By Christmas, it was already dreadfully clear it would not, and Lord Kitchener had begun his mass recruitment of a citizens' army of 1 million men. Although still too young to enlist, John decided to leave university at the end of his first year. He served as an unpaid volunteer in the YMCA at an army camp in North Wales. This was the very first time he had lived away from home. From then on, he would write home every few days, a practice he continued throughout his lifetime whenever he was away. These many hundreds of surviving letters form part of yesterday's generous deposition by the Cockcroft family to the Churchill Archive Centre. After signing on in October 1915, he was called up for training in the spring of 1916 in the Royal Field Artillery. At his own insistence, he volunteered as an ordinary gunner, resisting pressure from his parents to train as an officer. Essentially, this involved learning to load, aim, and fire a field gun, and ride a horse, for horses were still the prime movers on a battlefield. Just this he did. Just before his training ended, he learned quite by chance of an extension course to become a signaller. As its name implies, the job of a signaller was to transmit messages to and fro between observation posts set at or beyond the front line trenches, the gun lines and command posts. This also entailed maintaining these communications by laying and maintaining wire circuits across the battlefield, an exposed and potentially deadly task. He wrote, "If a wire breaks, you have to mend it, shells or no shells." In late September 1916, his artillery battery unit was sent to France to join the still ongoing Battle of the Somme. Today, all is peaceful, and with only memorials and cemeteries as a reminder of what happened. This is the Welsh Guards Memorial overlooking Mametz Wood near Albert. It was here he went into action nearly 101 years ago on the 14th of October 1916. He described the scene to his brother. "We live in a land of shell craters and mud, mixed with barbed wire, old bayonets and rifles, and trenches and dugouts everywhere." Nowhere was safe. Between set-piece attacks, both sides mounted skirmishes and engaged in sporadic shelling of one another. His letters home are a wonderfully balanced account of the life of an ordinary soldier, but occasionally emotion showed. I've seen my chums go west in a moment. It makes me realise all too fully what war is, the whole madness of it. A yard in the pitching of a shell, that's all there is between life and death. Eventually, after 17 months of such conditions, with little respite, he relented to his parents' wishes. I should like to have a few months in Blighty, if for nothing else than to relieve my mother's worries. He returned to England to begin officer training. It was fortunate he did so, for the Germans mounted their last great offensive in the spring of 1918. Only desperate fighting stopped them reaching Paris, but at great cost. The signaller's dugout in John's former battery was hit by a gas shell on the 1st of July 1918, with terrible consequences. He enjoyed the novelty of officer training. We've been swatting today, and it has felt quite delightful to be again acquiring some knowledge after many months without study at all. In contrast, he disdained the attitudes displayed by other officers. An old colonel who expressed a wish for another scrap aroused his ire. If some of these old regulars are permanent gentlemen, then I, for one, am glad I need an invitation only for the duration. Worse, the attitude of his newly commissioned fellow officers from public school backgrounds appalled him. Now they've got a batman, they make full use of them. They shout "piggins" even to his face. Thank heaven I shall be out of it. He left the army in 1919. His former commanding officer wrote to his mother, "The old battery owed many a debt to the splendid work and example of your son. He worked with an unassuming modesty and conscientiousness beyond all praise. His was one of the many cases of valour and devotion to duty going unrewarded." Having miraculously survived the war unscathed, John became engaged in October 1918 to Eunice Elizabeth Crabtree, affectionately known as Niecy, and sister of his then best friend. You see her here with her parents and 2 brothers. Faced with the prospect of marriage and post-war employment uncertainties, he needed to find a secure future. He resumed his university studies, not in mathematics, but in electrical engineering, a subject with much greater employment prospects. He went to the Manchester College of Technology. Here he came under the tutelage of Miles Walker, a former scholar of St. John's College, Cambridge. After Cambridge, Miles Walker had joined the American firm of Westinghouse. Interesting what we've heard about Westinghouse today. Before returning to England to help establish their large greenfield factory at Trafford Park, Manchester. He left them in 1912 to become Professor of Electrical Engineering. John graduated with first-class honours in electrical engineering in the summer of 1920. Manufacture of electrical equipment for power supplies and industrial applications was then a boom industry. Westinghouse UK, now renamed Metrovic, held a leading place. With Miles Walker's connections, it's unsurprising John became one of their college apprentices. Compared to much of British industry, Metrovic had an enlightened attitude to recruitment and training. At its centre was Arthur Fleming, head of the company's education and research departments. Fleming was a contemporary of Walker from their early days of Westinghouse UK. This environment suited John perfectly. In the evenings, he studied for his MSc, whilst gaining practical experience during the day as he progressed through various sections of the factory. By 1922, he had joined Fleming's research department. He might have subsequently built a secure career with Metrovic. Fortunately for history, Walker and Fleming concurred that this young man was what today we would call a high flyer, who would benefit from even more formal education. Walker persuaded John to apply to his old college, St. John's, to read mathematics. John had his doubts. It does not appear anything will come of it, he wrote in February 1922. His doubts revolved around the necessity of winning scholarships and grants to support his studies. John confided to Niecy, "I would love to go to Cambridge, but it's really got rather late." However, he won the necessary scholarships and so went to John's in October 1922. His director of studies was a distinguished mathematician Ebenezer Cunningham. He wrote of John, "We picked him as a chap to have." John, after his selection interview with Cunningham, summed up his own hopes. "This is a gorgeous place." Cunningham, like Walker and Fleming, believed in supporting talented young men. Right, I'll have to rattle up. In 1924, Miles Walker once again intervened to guide John's career. He, along with Fleming, knew Lord Rutherford, for Rutherford had been Professor of Physics at Manchester. The Cavendish under Rutherford became the preeminent place in the world for experimental research in atomic physics. Merely to be accepted there as a postgraduate student was an exceptional distinction. On Miles Walker's recommendations, Rutherford interviewed John and offered him a place on condition he passed Part 2 mathematics. He didn't disappoint those who had encouraged and supported him thus far. On the 15th of June 1924, after he had received his degree in mathematics, he wrote, "I went to see Rutherford today. He's going to take me on, and I am to see him tomorrow to discuss matters thoroughly." Rutherford assigned him to Peter Kapitsa, who was researching the effects of intense magnetic fields. And he told Nisi of the machine that they then built, which Sir John designed. "It is on such a large and audacious scale for a physical experiment, nothing like it has been attempted before." Nisi worried he was working too hard. He replied, "It's often necessary for people of my age to work 3 or 4 hours in the evenings, because without work of this intensity, it's impossible to get anywhere." In 1932, as we've heard, this work produced spectacular results when he and Ernest Walton announced the first disintegration of an atom by artificial means. This picture helps to explain why. Oops, sorry. We've lost the picture. Where's it gone? My apologies, what's happened? It's stuck. Never mind. You've got to imagine this, there are 39 people in the picture. No, we've lost it. Forget it. It's the last picture anyway. 39 people in the picture, 11, over a quarter of them, were or would become Nobel Prize winners. And I'll just jump to the very last line of my talk because time's pressing. It's fitting to end my talk with the words of his former schoolmaster. "I was always confident Jack's exceptional powers would achieve greatness, and that his modesty would not be shaken by whatever honour and fame he might accomplish."
I want to talk more about the family, really. My father and mother were a partnership in marriage, working together for the good of the family, friends, colleagues, and mankind. He, a busy, much-travelled man, she who kept him on the road, packing his clothes, seeing him on his way, looking after the entertainment schedule, because they were great entertainers, and ensured that the family was in one piece. So who was she? As Michael might have explained, she was a member of the Crabtree family, and she's seen here in the middle of the picture, along with her brother, Frank, and her older brother, Harry, and her parents are on the right-hand side. And she is in the middle of her grandparents. And this picture here shows her with her mother. Eunice Elizabeth Crabtree and my father, John Douglas Cockcroft, knew each other through school, and more particularly through my mother's brother Frank, who was my father's best friend. When they were young, before they got married, they spent many hours walking in the hills, going to the Lake District, and climbing through the Lake District up to Scafell Pike and other things like that. But then they eventually got married, as Michael has said, on August the 26th, 1925. And they set up a home in Cambridge, first at Grantchester Meadows, and then at 11 at Little St Mary's Lane, and finally they managed to build their own home in Sedley Taylor Road. And this is them outside the side door of their house in Sedley Taylor Road. But my father was also busy in the lab life, and here he is on the right-hand side as a member of the Kapitsa Club. As we've heard before, Peter Kapitsa was an explosive character in the Cavendish who decided to have a little club to liven up the life of the scientists, and each of them had to present a paper on some scientific matter once a week. Now this course brought together many people, and many of those gentlemen there became my parents' lifelong friends. Along with these two particular people, Mark Oliphant, Peter Kapitsa, and Neil Spohr were amongst many, many international friends. And here my father is in the Solvay Conference in Copenhagen. There he met many, many more famous European scientists, and indeed scientists from the US. And he visited Russia and many laboratories in Europe. And here is my mother watching quietly over us. I believe that was at Bognor Regis while my three sisters played on the beach. So she was keeping the family together while my father travelled. In 1937, he went on a US tour. And here he is with Ernst Lawrence in Ernst Lawrence's car. And this is Ernst Lawrence cyclotron. And this is Merle Tweeve also, who built a very large Van de Graaff generator. And these two people, along with other people who he'd met, became crucial in the Second World War to this country. My father became a member of the Tizard mission, where a scientific mission to the United States, where the research knowledge that had been gathered in this country was taken to the United States and exposed to the United States scientists with a view to getting them to help us in the war effort. On the left side, you'll see a famous meeting at Tuxedo Park, where my father met with Alfred Loomis, who was on the right-hand side, and Ernst Lawrence, and many other people. And in the middle is Taffy Bowen, who was the person who looked after the cavity magnetron. And they showed the magnetron. Well, they'd not shown it earlier to a meeting in Washington, but they exposed all the drawings at this particular meeting. And at that point in time, Alfred Loomis, who was a private physicist and also had been in the banking world or business world, decided there and then that he would finance the radiation laboratory at MIT, and for which we are very grateful as a nation, because from there developed a lot of airborne radar and things like that. In parallel, in Canada, my father also encouraged scientists to help us with the war effort. And this is Colonel Phillips of the radiation, radio and electronic corps in Canada, who also undertook to build radar sets for the United Kingdom. Although his ones, I think, were more to do with gun-laying radars and things like that. So my father was very involved in bringing American scientists into the war. In the meantime, back home, because he was only allowed to go overseas by his boss for a few months, I think he overstayed his time in the United States by some 3 months, but he came back to be the director of the Army Development and Research Establishment at Malvern, which working on Army gun-laying radars and such. And these are some of the things that came out of ADRE Malvern. These are gun-laying radars. But on the right, you see a typical proximity fuse. And this we've been developing in this country, but my father foresaw that we were not getting enough supplies of those, in time to beat the V1 doodle bugs. So he went over to the States and negotiated with the Americans, and we got some more advanced American radars and from Merle-Tweeve proximity fuses for our Army 3.7-inch guns. And these became very crucial in overcoming the V1 doodle bugs. So an important contribution to the war there, apart from anything else. Having successfully been involved in all these negotiations, he became very trusted by people, both internationally, particularly in the US. And because of that, he was invited to take over the Chalk River and Montreal laboratories, which laid the foundation of British nuclear, also Anglo-Canadian nuclear project. And we remained there for a few years. But we as a family he wanted to have us with us. So we crossed the Atlantic in the Mauritania, and we took up residence in Upper Rosslyn Avenue in Montreal. And this is, on the left is myself with my mother at the age of about 3, and my sisters overlooking a lookout near our house, because Upper Rosslyn Avenue was above the city of Montreal, and we had a lovely view across the city. Then we moved to Deep River, which was the dormitory town for Chalk River project. And this is us outside our house at number 17 Beach Avenue, enjoying the rather cold Canadian weather. And indeed, we were fortunate insofar as our house had a furnace. Many of the houses for the families in Deep River have been imported from a previous project where they cut the houses in half, brought them along and put them into new foundations with very little more than a pot-bellied stove as heating. But we had a furnace. And it said that most of the married families suffered poorly compared with those single people who lived in the staff hostel, which was steam heated. However, the national need called, and my father was asked to come back to Harwell to head up the atomic energy establishment at Harwell. Now, I have mentioned before that my parents were great entertainers. They loved bringing to people from all levels to have sherry parties, to learn to meet together, to learn about each other, and to talk and exchange ideas. But we came back to Harwell too, and this is my family sitting in number 1 South Drive at Harwell in 1948, I believe, 46, 48, I'm not quite sure. And here we are again, as a family, up at my grandmother's in Tomberton. We often went there for Christmas. And also on holiday in North Norfolk. And later on, when my parents had bought a house at Clay next to the sea, where the family archive has been stored for all these years, that's us in the garden as we grew steadily older. But as has been said, my father was very involved internationally. And this is him at the Second Atoms of Peace Conference in Geneva, when he began to get involved in nuclear disarmament and that sort of talk. But my mother at the same time was giving talks on his behalf, opening schools and and opening fates. So she herself was giving talks and supporting him. And finally we moved back to Cambridge, where this is Winston Churchill planting the tree and my father looking on. And they were both very, very delighted to come back to Cambridge. Although my mother, I think, would have liked to go back to St. John's College, but we came to Churchill because of the wishes of Winston Churchill. And I think my father really did enjoy that great project. Here he is in his study at the Master's Lodge, where at the time students could pass by seeing him at work, and many have said that was an inspiration to them. But again, my parents brought together members of the SCR, the middle common room and the senior common room at sherry parties so all could meet, and very often to meet international visitors as well. And I think it was a way of life that he really felt that he should bring people together. And here he is, during that period, he travelled an awful lot, and my mother began to travel with him. She'd stayed at home a lot of times in the past, looking after us, but then she decided, well, it was time for her to travel. So they travelled to India. My father became the Chancellor of the Australian National University in Canberra for a 4-year term. And my father accompanied him on all his visits to that country. I'm sorry, I don't have a photograph of that time. And finally, they also went to Moscow to visit their old friends, Peter and Anna Kapitsa. And here they are enjoying some of the street scenes in Moscow. And Peter and Anna Kapitsa eventually were allowed to come out of Russia in 1966. And here they are, enjoying some time together on the lawns. And finally, unfortunately, my father died on September the 18th, 1967. And here is my mother unveiling one of many memorial plaques to him, at this particular one at Harwell. But she dearly wanted a biography to be written about my father, and she struggled for a long time for this to come to fruition. And here she is with the two authors, Guy Hartcup and Ali Bone, who co-authored that book at the launch of the book in Churchill College in January 1984. So I give to you Sir John and Lady Cockcroft and their lives, two people who from their love was their strength. I and my sisters will be always grateful for their care and guidance, for the opportunities that were put in our way, and for their unspoken influence on us in our approach to our fellow humans. My parents held sherry parties, as I have said, wherever they were, bringing together people from all levels of an organisation to get to know and understand each other. My mother supported him in this steadfastly in his ventures, holding tea parties for the wives, spouses of the organisation and attending fetes, etc. My father, through his work, worldwide scientific friends, did his best to make the world a better place. Thank you.
An amazing trio of talks of very different kinds. We've got a bit of time for questions. Please, can you make sure you specify which of the three you're aiming them at? It may be obvious. You'll keep it short.
We've just seen two pictures of Sir John with his staff. The first one showed Nun May and Pontecorvo, and the second one showed Fuchs. How hard did it hit him when it became clear that those three were traitors?
I was too young, really.
I think I don't think it hit him hard in the sense that he despaired, because he wasn't responsible for the security vetting of any of his staff. That was MI5, MI6, and it was their job. When, of course, Fuchs was arrested, he had to deal with the fallout of that, obviously, in the press in particular. But again, by that time in his career, he'd got, as has already been mentioned, he'd had a very wide capability of dealing with the press, and the press trusted him. So when he spoke about it and said, I just did not know or even suspect, people respected that viewpoint. And although it was a huge scandal, obviously, it passed off without affecting his career, I think, in any way.
Graham, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just happen to have one anecdote passed to me from a great George Steiner, one of our colleagues here. George told me that he was always completely confounded by John's imperturbability. It seemed that you could drop a bomb on him and he would barely adjust his tie. And he asked him in the fellows' room one evening, was there anything that's ever perturbed you? And he said, all right, I'll admit it. And that was the disclosure that none may was or the accusation that he was a spy. And then he was quick to qualify. He said, after that, I learnt my lesson. And after the real disaster of finding that Fuchs was a traitor, that he did take very much in his stride. That is passed on from George Steiner, neither are from my direct experience.
I think I'd comment that in my lifetime, my father, I think, from his First World War experiences, learned that things happened and you had to live with what had happened and get on with life. And indeed, that was his attitude to any accidents that myself or my sisters had. He would just say, oh, law, turn round, see that it was fixed, and hope that we'd learned our lessons from our mistakes. He never really criticised us, that I remember, for these accidents. He just made sure that things were put right and that we'd learnt our lessons, and life moved on.
Mine is not a question, it's just a little addition to what may be added to Sir John's biography. And that's about his links to Ghana, my country. Before 1966, my country had started an atomic energy project with the help of the Soviet Union. And in 1966, 24th February, our first president was overthrown, Kwame Nkrumah. And it was necessary to review the whole atomic energy program. So Joe Corte, who later became a fellow of Churchill College, was then the chairman of the atomic energy and my professor in chemistry. He invited Sir John Cockcroft to come to Ghana and assess the nuclear project. And if the Ghana Atomic Energy Commission is what it is today, I think the foundations were laid by Sir John Cockcroft. And at the time he visited Ghana in 1966, Alan Nonme, who has just been mentioned, was the head of the physics department in the university, and I was a student then. I came to Churchill on the 21st of September, 1967, just 3 days after the death of Sir John Cockcroft. And that's the little that I would like to add. If there is some more research to be done to add to his biography, I think this is an important link to whatever he did for the world. Africa was missing from all that we've heard so far. I think this should be something to add to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like asking difficult questions. I wonder if any of you would care to speculate whether and how Churchill College might have been a different place had Sir John lived longer as we would all have wished. And do we know of any plans or aspirations that were unfulfilled at the time of his death?
Well, my instant reaction to that is, first of all, is what I call his last great project at Churchill was to mastermind and steer the admission of women to the men's colleges at Cambridge. He was the chief architect of that, although much of the work here was, of course, done by Dick Tizard in terms of all this necessary spade work and committee work and so on and so on and so on. And I think that came out of his experience and indeed belief that you should treat people as human beings and not as troublesome students. And of course, he'd learned that firsthand through his experience, particularly in setting up Chalk River in 1944, then his experience of setting up Harwell. So he believed in treating people sensitively. And sadly, of course, he didn't live to see the fulfilment of that what he'd started in the mid-1960s.
No, I don't have a comment. Maybe there's some senior fellows that remember
I think
that.
There's another quote.
Yeah,
I think he would have. It's difficult now when you look back how different Cambridge was 50 years ago, and I think how he was revolutionary in many ways, and I think to me it's summed up, and I'm sure he'd have kept that spirit of being in a leadership position in the world, encourage international science and so on. But I think the way I sum it up and how revolutionary he was in his change of attitude, in the college council minutes, there's a nice little phrase when they're discussing what Churchill College should be like. And he says, "There's no need for spikes." And that's a reference, ladies and gentlemen, to the fact that many of the traditional colleges used to have spikes sticking out of their walls so the students couldn't climb in and certainly couldn't bring women into the college and all the sort of strange things that people do.
Tim.
Tim Cribb, retired fellow here. Something that college has not continued that he had started, which is now discontinued visibly in the architecture of this room. At the back, when I joined the college in 1970, there were a row of translation booths, which Cockcroft had insisted should be built in to this hall for the Pugwash conferences. They were, which were international, for international sciences, on the peaceful uses of atomic energy. That was clearly a mission dear to his heart. Well, we have the papers in the archive, the Rotblat papers, but we're not doing anything about accomplishing the mission.
I hear you. There's a question at the front here.
Very brief related question is whether anybody knows if he was behind the decision not to put a chapel at Churchill College.
Oh. How long have you got? I think, again, just very briefly, the original architect's drawing for Churchill had a chapel which is at the right-hand side of the main entrance. And it caused the idea of building a chapel, when that became known to the fellows, caused a huge furore. And Francis Crick, who was an early fellow, resigned, saying the students would be better off with a bordello. That's the famous phrase. But equally, I think it's also clear that he appointed a man that many of us will remember, Canon Noel Duckworth, an exceptional man. And I think, again, that's an example of how Sir John followed a policy, I think, you can see it clearly in all his other work, of appointing highly able, but not necessarily yes men, to key roles. So he'd appointed the Canon Duckworth, and then they had the furore. And here again, I think you see his skilled ability to navigate through all sorts of conflicting currents, and eventually the chapel got built. And of course, there's this wonderful compromise. It's not called Churchill College Chapel, it's the chapel at Churchill College, and it stands on its own piece of ground leased by the college. And that side, to me, is a wonderful example of how he steered his way through many, many difficult circumstances. I don't think it's fair to say he was a religious man, but he had a strong Methodist upbringing, and he believed in the principles of good behaviour and treating people fairly. So that's, I think, the 5-minute version of the chapel story. Mark Goldie's sitting over there. He's written the long version.
Possibly for the bar.
May I just I just wanted, if I may, just add one anecdote, something that hasn't come up this afternoon, that in reading about John recently, it just tickled me. And that is that he was a very wide reader. He wasn't one of these rectilinear thinkers who was only interested in one branch of science and to hell with the humanities and everything. He really did read widely. And in his talk at Manchester Grammar School, he encouraged students, whatever they were interested, to excel in that subject, but always read widely. And even then, he found a way of referring back to his hero, Rutherford. And he told a story about Rutherford at Trinity College. And you may know that Rutherford used to work like a dog until 5:30 and then shut the lab. Right? Much to the annoyance of some people. Right? Didn't like people working in the evenings. That's when you read. And Rutherford would read Wells, he'd read Jane Austen, what have you, read very widely. Anyway, Rutherford at this gathering at Trinity was sitting next to a bishop just right next to Cockcroft. And Rutherford said to this bishop, "What are you reading at the moment?" And the bishop said, I'm just too busy to read anything outside, the Bible. And Rutherford said, "Oh, it's a real dog's life, isn't it?"
Right, have we got one last question before we close? No, everyone is finished off with that story. I think that's been a fascinating afternoon. Thank you three so much. I can see that the pressure on the 7th Master of Churchill is not going to go away if we're going to have a pugwash conference here. Interesting times. But anyhow, we've learnt a great deal from the three of you and from Sue and Rolf earlier. So would you all join me in thanking the three of them?
Thank you.